इंडिया स्पीक्स डेली को सब्सक्राइब करें, उसके बेल आइकन को ज़रूर दबाएं यदि आपको इसकी पत्रकारिता पसंद हो। धन्यवाद।
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to India Speaks Daily. Protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act have gone on for quite a while now. Although after the Prime Minister's public address yesterday, there's certainly some hope of the protests losing momentum. There's certainly some hope of the protests losing their ebb and flow gradually. Protests in Delhi and National Capital Region, after an initial phase of a lot of violence, are now mostly peaceful, with a large number of young people, especially educated youth of India, participating in these protests, which have become largely peaceful now. But in several states of India, including the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, the protests are still violence-ridden, with a lot of people losing their lives. Now, one thing that one has observed in these protests, and especially the media coverage of these protests, the way the English media, the left liberal media has covered these protests, is that the protests are being framed, the news is being framed exclusively from the angle of supposed non-inclusion of Muslims, of the Muslim community in the Citizenship Amendment Act. And this is what people are by and large protesting against. And if you see their interviews that the young students are giving to the media channels, they are talking about the fact that how Muslims will be disenfranchised once CAA gets implemented, and they're talking about the probability of the injustices that might be meted out to the Muslim community of India once the CAA gets implemented. And the entire discourse around protests centers around that the supposed non-inclusion of the name Muslims in the CAA, in the Citizenship Amendment Act, is going against the secular fabric, is going against the secular ethics of the Indian Constitution. But what is surprising is the fact that none of the civil society organizations, none of the protesters are actually talking about the real issue. They're not talking about the other side of the story, the very purpose of this new law, and which is the issue of persecution of minorities in Muslim majority countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And it is amazing that this issue has been conveniently shoved off under the carpet. Now there are people, especially young people, educated young people of India from cities, from premium universities, participating in these protests in huge numbers, irrespective of their caste, creed, religion, etc., which is of course wonderful considering that India is a democratic country and everybody undoubtedly here has a right to protest peacefully. But what is disconcerting here is the fact that while these people, the protesters, are fighting, they're willing to risk their lives for a theoretical issue, which is the supposed injustices, the supposed abuses that might be done to the Muslim community of India once the CAA is implemented. So let's remember that it's a theoretical premise on which all of these fights, these protests are going on, because the CAA has just been implemented and it's not concerned with Indian Muslims at all, prima facie. But still, the protesters are fighting on a completely theoretical premise, which is churning out futuristic predictions of India becoming a Hindu state, and of Muslims being gradually thrown out of the country, and of India becoming a majoritarian Hindu state. So basically, a lot of speculation going on here, and on the basis of a purely theoretical premise that these protests are going on. But these protesters are completely silent on a concrete, realistic issue, which is the issue of the lived concrete reality of minorities, including Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, etc., in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. The concrete realities of these minorities, which these minorities have lived and who have fled persecution in these respective countries. So why are these protesters not talking about these realities also? Because if they're truly secular, if they're truly intellectual, then they should be undoubtedly presenting both the sides of the picture, right? They should be sort of presenting before the people both the sides of the situation. Because the word secular by its definition means viewing all religions impartially. So by excluding Hindus, by creating a phobia against Hindus, and by choosing not to talk about these minorities because they happen to Hindu, is then also being anti-secular. That also is doing a disservice to secularism. So this fact is really disconcerting that none of the protesters or the civil society organizations or the media are talking about this real issue, which is the issue of persecution of these minorities. And why isn't any media having debates around this issue? Why aren't the media organizations, the news channels giving data on this issue of persecution of minorities? This issue, which is the very basis of this law, has been completely conveniently evaded, while a whole imaginary debate to flare up the sentiments of the Indian public has been constructed around the supposed harm that will be done to India's Muslim community and India's secular fabric once the CAA gets implemented. And perhaps the protesters are not to be blamed here. It's India's left liberal media, and it's by and large the communist propaganda which is to blame here, which has brainwashed the Indians to such an extent that the word Hindu itself has begun to carry pejorative connotations, which has created such a phobia around the word Hindu that many young educated people today do not want to associate themselves with the word Hindu, and leave apart associating themselves. They do not want to talk about the rights of anybody who is a Hindu, because then they have the fear of being seen as bigotous. Then they face the fear of being seen as backward, as not modern, as a fascist, and so on and so forth. So this is a classic sort of propaganda, kind of malice around the word Hinduism, around the word Hindus, that has been built by the communist propaganda machinery. And you tell us if this is secular, then the definition of secularism surely is flawed. This is totally non-secular to create this kind of a hatred against a particular community, because secularism means being able to impartially discuss things, being able to impartially discuss facts about all religions without any biases whatsoever. So it is not the BJP, not the Bharatiya Janata Party here which is being non-secular, but it is the entire discourse, the pseudo-intellectual discourse which is being created around this issue, that is being non-secular by the kind of phobia that it is attaching around the word Hindu, and by choosing to completely ignore the issue of persecuted minorities in Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh, by the way, just because they happen to be Hindus. Now coming to some facts, a court in Pakistan, and this happened pretty recently, a day or two back, convicted a university lecturer by the name of Junaid Hafiz. Now the court in Pakistan sentenced Junaid Hafiz to death. The court gave Junaid Hafiz a death sentence on charges of blasphemy, that is on charges of disrespecting the Prophet and the Quran. Now Hafiz has been held in solitary confinement since 2014 due to apparent security concerns, and his lawyer, a prominent human rights activist called Rashid Rahman was also murdered. Now, Amnesty International, a UK-based rights group, has strongly condemned the judgment. Now, the reason I'm bringing out this case of awarding of death sentence to this young academic from Pakistan, a Muslim academic on charges of blasphemy, is because while the whole of left liberal media in India is rather preoccupied with talking about the protests and the supposed ways in which the Muslims will be marginalized after the CAA, and the way it's sort of portraying the BJP government as an anti-Muslim draconian government, is surprisingly enough silent on this issue. They're of course carrying cursory news of this issue of Junaid Hafiz being awarded the death sentence, but they're simply not talking about this issue at length. And why they're not doing it is because they're scared that if they talk about Junaid Hafiz's death sentence on account of blasphemy in Pakistan, then an entire Pandora's box will open up. Then this will open up an entire discussion on the abuse and atrocities committed on minorities in Pakistan. Because you can well imagine that if a Muslim person, an intellectual and academic, can be subjected to such harassment in Pakistan that he can be awarded a death sentence on account of blasphemy, then what will be the plight of people in Pakistan who do not follow Islam? What will be the plight of people in Pakistan who believe in other religions, who do not sort of believe in Prophet Muhammad? Don't you think that their lives are probably at stake all the time? And even if they are not being awarded death sentences in the courts of law in Pakistan, the religious leaders of Pakistan, the extremists who are present there, are probably after their life all the time. So the left liberal media does not want to talk about this case because it does not want to sort of bring out this issue of the injustices being meted out to minorities in Pakistan. Now there's another case. Asia Bibi, a Christian woman, was also accused of blasphemy last year, and Asia Bibi was got acquitted by the Pakistani Supreme Court though, and she was granted asylum in Canada. Now Asia Bibi, a Christian woman. And recently in the month of September, the Pakistani police also detained a Hindu school principal, again on charges of blasphemy, and these charges were slapped on him by one of his students. So just imagine the kind of state it is. If a student can slap charges of blasphemy on his own teacher, then you can imagine the kind of atrocities that can be committed on the minorities in that country, the kind of fear that the minorities in that country are going through. And just by contrast, in India is a secular country, and so many people of different castes, creed, ethnicities, religions live here, practice their religions peacefully. And just imagine the kind of contrast, and just imagine the paradox of it all, that rather than highlighting the kind of atrocities that are committed in Pakistan, both in people from majority as well as minority communities, the intellectuals, the so-called intellectuals here, are hell-bent on painting India as an authoritative state. They're hell-bent on painting India as a dystopia for Muslims, when in India, everybody has a right to practice his or her faith very peacefully. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are endless stories of torture, abuse, and intimidation of Hindus. And a lot of Hindus in Pakistan are not allowed to practice their religion at all, and it is these minorities who have fled persecution in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh that the Citizenship Amendment Act seeks to create a provision to provide citizenship to. And it is not like as if the act is saying that that Muslim refugees do not have a right to citizenship at all. Even Muslim refugees can claim citizenship after a period of 11 years. All that the act is doing is giving certain priorities to these refugees from the minority communities of Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh to get citizenship in India. It is neither a conspiracy against the Indian Muslims, nor is it denying Muslim refugees from other countries the right to apply for citizenship. Let us remember that, because this is a major propaganda being propagated by people who are taking a very simplistic view of the Citizenship Amendment Act, that by excluding the word Muslims, any Muslim refugees here will not be able to apply for citizenship. Now that is nothing could be farther from the facts. Even the Muslim refugees living in India can apply for citizenship. It is just giving certain priorities to the persecuted minorities from Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And my friends, these minorities, the people, if you see them, if you meet them, if you read about their stories, they're not even a part of the middle class or the lower middle class. They're from very disempowered communities. These are poor people who fled to India on the pretext of a pilgrimage, and they're living in makeshift camps in Punjab, in Delhi. They're living in various parts of India in these makeshift camps, and they're somehow eking out a living by doing small odd jobs, by working as a daily wage laborer. There was a story of a woman in Punjab who is earning her livelihood by sewing footballs. So you can just well imagine the kind of disenfranchised lives that these people, these persecuted minorities, these minorities who fear persecution in these Islamic countries, the kind of realities they're living in India, and just try to look at them through the lens of economic and disenfranchisement that they've gone through. Try to look at them through the lens of trauma and torture that they've gone through, and then for once and all, do not look at them through the lens of religion. Do not look at them as quote unquote Hindus whom you're vilifying, and just because these people happen to be Hindus and belong to other minorities, you're simply creating a narrative, a case, a cruel narrative of vengeance against these minorities from Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bangladesh. So the Congress and the left here should stop playing dirty politics and should be magnanimous enough to understand that this is a case of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. Indian culture has always stood for Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, the whole world one family, and which is precisely why India has always welcomed people from across the world. So there is no reason that why India should not welcome its own people, minorities from these countries who were left there after partition for whatever reasons, but they continue to suffer abuse and torture and do not have the freedom to practice their religion. The Pakistani government too should not play politics on this issue, and it should look at this whole episode as an opportunity to introspect, as an opportunity to sort of try and rectify its mistakes, as an opportunity to make Pakistan a more religiously tolerant country. And it should also have the magnanimity to agree with the government of India to let these minority refugees come to India and seek citizenship here, if Pakistan is not unable to take care of these minorities living on its soil.